Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Nobody with another episode of Making Nobody Happy. Now, I've been randomly going kind of all over the place with my entries so far. There's a lot of things I'd like to talk about, but I also haven't wanted to get into immediately. But there comes a time where there are things that I want to talk about, and some of them are more serious subjects, some of them are more difficult questions, some of them are more likely to generate some heat and some opinions. And I don't want to create controversy too much. I'm not actually a very argumentative person. I'm not a very confrontational person. If you've ever been in a class with me sometime in the past when I was in school, you might think that that was very untrue, because when I get into discussions, I'm very quick to disagree. I'm also someone who's not willing to just go along with what other people think. I tend to have a little bit of a sort of bloody-mindedness to me. I like going the opposite direction from other people. But at the same time, I'm actually someone who really doesn't like creating trouble, creating controversy, but I do really like thinking about things and thinking about questions and thinking about tough questions. And so I hope as I start to get into more of those topics on this show, that you will bear with me and have patience with me and follow along with me in the journey of exploring some of these questions. So one of the things that I want to talk about today is pornography polygamy? And that probably sounds like a very unusual question, although maybe you've thought about it, maybe you haven't. So let's discuss that. Does the existence and the pervasiveness of pornography in our culture today basically commit all women to the inescapable fact of some form of virtual polygamy? Usage statistics are so enormous among men, and the social norms forbidding it are so absolutely in tatters, that it's just virtually an inescapable condition of sexual relationships from now on. I don't know if you've looked at the statistics, but they're pretty insane. It's a genie that was let out of the bottle and didn't just go to a few places, it literally went everywhere. So you're not going to find anyone, basically, except for this very, very, very tiny, we're literally talking like 2%, who isn't already in an existing relationship with pornography. And it's also not likely that that person is going to be willing to just entirely give up that relationship, as it carries no widespread social cost for them to have it. And there's really no competitive alternative to it. So women are essentially committed to sharing their husband's sexuality with their pornographic partners. And also more and more men, as porn use has increased quite a lot, actually, among women. But that's a topic for another time, because it really is a separate subject. It's the way that women use the internet is different from the way that men use the internet, and the way that even women use pornography is different from the way that men use the pornography. But both are increasing. It is something that has has a big effect on both sexes, and has a growing effect among women. Anyway, now maybe to you it doesn't actually seem plausible that real flesh and blood women are actually, in their actual lives and relationships, in competition with pornography, or that pornography actually constitutes any form of real sexual relationship or dalliance. That is definitely something that the current culture, if you just turn on TV shows, like, that's already clearly been decided by the wider culture that is not the case. And maybe it does seem a little silly comparing the effects of pornography on society and on relationships in society to the effects of widespread polygamy, much less to imply that having your partner watch pornography is in any way similar to being in a polyamorous relationship. To that, I would say, if that's what you think, then you don't know what a marriage is. You haven't thought that hard about it, and you don't know men, and you don't know the power of the internet. it is essential to the power of digital media that it is not only able to simulate lived human realities that naturally trigger innate psychological and neurological responses, but that it be tailored in such a way to be even more compelling than those realities. Compelling enough to compete for your time and investment. I mean, your kids these days are always staring at your phone. Probably you too. Me too. We all say, oh, I should get out and probably be in the real world. Do you do it? How much of your total time ends up being sucked up by the digital alternative to it? Quite a lot. It is competitive for your life. Digital media deliberately takes advantage of those innate psychological and neurological mechanisms to develop a very intense connection to its users. Like video games, they don't just manipulate your neurological and neurochemical responses, they actually do so more easily and more directly as a result of deliberate design than real life does or can. Social media does the same. It knows how to flip those switches actually more easily, more strongly, and more directly than normal interactions can. The stuff that, those responses were originally designed for. Websites and social media platforms and places like YouTube, they're carefully tailored and they are gamed to elicit positive responses and create reinforcement and promote engagement, because ultimately their goal would be to have you engaged 100%. It is entirely to their financial advantage to capture all of you, to be a genuine competitor. You see commercials like that where it's like, now you can watch the sports news every second of your life. It's not that they want just some tiny portion of it, or they think, oh, we really can't compete against all the other things in your life. You'll want to pay attention to those. No. That's one of the other things about digital media. It competes without restraint. There isn't a maximum amount of time on their platforms or a maximum limit to your engagement or devotion to them that they're trying to achieve. In an ideal world, you would always be connected. You would always be engaged. You would always be getting reinforced. You would always be being tracked. Why? Because engagement equals revenue. And that is their goal. So, pornography reflects that. There is a sort of built-in limit to pornography in some ways. I mean, you can really look at an unlimited amount of time, but you can only, if you're a man, act on it a limited number of times within a certain time period. That's just a sort of physiological limit, but it's not that huge of a thing. There are people who genuinely do disappear their whole life down that rabbit hole. But we don't have to talk about that kind of extreme, although that is an interesting case. I'm not so much interested in talking about people whose entire relational lives have been absorbed, or even their entire life. Just if this is a common and ubiquitous factor among everyone, what does it mean for existing or future romantic relationships? So anyway, as I said, in a very simple way, the goal of digital media is to be as desirable and as pleasing and as useful as is humanly possible. And all of these digital platforms are in competition with each other for your time, for your engagement, for you. And they're also in competition with the demands of real life. And real life often loses that contest. Young men these days, they work far less and they play video games way more than they used to. Young girls get together and spend time together way, way less. And they spend way more time on social media. Both sexes date and interact far less than in any previous generation, period. There has actually been a massive decline in real life activities in favor of digital and online activities. So if you want more detail on the degree to which technology acts as a significant alternative and competitor to real life activities, including pornography, there are a couple of books I can recommend. One of them is iGen. by an author who's written various books about generational science, and that's a really good book because it's about what we call Gen Z. She calls it iGen. It's basically the generation that grew up in the digital world, whereas millennials, the digital world was sort of dawning in the early part of their lives. So I'm technically one of the oldest millennials, and I saw the digital world come into existence, but it didn't actually exist when I was younger. It came into being during it, and we adopted it as it came along. But iGen, or Gen Z, has actually grown up inside it, and a large portion of their life and their identity is actually fully digital, and not in the real world. And so iGen's a really good book for that. And if you want a book that's specifically about pornography, Cheap Sex by Mark Regnerus, that is a great book on pornography specifically, and how the mating marketplace has changed as a result of the sort of revaluation caused by the flooding of the market that pornography has caused. Both of these books are really data-heavy books, tons and tons of charts, but they're very understandable. They're very approachable, actually. Like I said, there's an enormous amount of data. There's probably more than you actually really want to know, but there's a lot in there about how our real lives are actually being restructured by, in massive ways we never could have foreseen, by the digital life, and how large sections of our real lives are actually being replaced by our digital lives. So, like I said, if you want to look at sexuality specifically, check out Cheap Sex. If you're just interested more in general, behaviorally, adoption of milestones of life, how young people are actually spending their time, iGen is probably a stronger book for that. So, building off of some of the data from those books, one thing that I will bring you is that pornography is the ultimate form of cheap sex. But don't mistake it, it is a kind of sex, especially by modern definitions. And it is a real relationship alternative and avenue for sexual activity, of which there is a finite supply. I mean, there is a finite supply of sexual activity. So your husband, women, for example, has a finite amount of sexual attention. It probably seems like, in fact, he has an infinite amount, and maybe it seems good to divert some of that. But the truth is, the fact is there. Humans, whether men or women, we have a finite amount of sexual attention to give. There is a finite number of orgasms that a man can have. There is a finite number of hormonal and neurological responses that a man can develop and pursue, that your husband can develop and pursue. And you, as his wife, have to share that finite supply now with a harem of digital women. And they are far more competitive than you might expect. And that's partly because there is an essentially infinite quantity of them, or at least exponentially more of them than there is of him to give. So our digital lives are in direct competition with our embodied lives. As I earlier explained, the data, which I said you can check these books out. There's lots of other places you can look, of course, but the data really shows that. Therefore, our digital sexual partners are in direct competition with our actual partners. And the digital partners have a lot going for them. And I think we should take a moment to explore what exactly that is. And not everyone wants to do that, but I think it's something you really actually have to think about. You have to actually look at the problem. So, in many ways, digital sexual partners enjoy a lot of the same advantages as all digital alternatives. We have many digital alternatives for things, digital venues for things, and a lot of them have the same advantages. Convenience, accessibility, extremely low cost, extensive reach, enormous variety, specific algorithmic targeting. You can find whatever the little thing is that you specifically are looking for. Commitment, simplicity, repeatability, adaptability. These are all the things that you see from digital platforms, and they wear those advantages openly on their sleeves. So I'm reminded, talking about this, of you might see this as a tangential example. It's an old example, but it just sort of makes a point. This is a lo-fi version. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Street of Breasts in Venice. There's an actual street. Its name basically means the Street of Breasts. And the question is, well, how did it get that name? That is an unusual name. It's not because of some architectural thing. It's not because of something to do with the shapes of the buildings. It's not something to do with anything to do with the street itself. It's to do with actual breasts. So at the time that street was named, there was this proliferation of male prostitutes. And they were willing to provide their services to men at way cheaper rates than the fairly expensive female courtesans of Venice. And the women, the female prostitutes, saw this as an unfair competitive practice, undercutting them on price, undermining their industry, undermining their livelihood, and sort of breaking the pact that governed their guild. There was this group outside it that was just like, we're going to come in and we'll do it cheaper. And so, like any trade union, they engaged in protectionist actions against the scabs who were stealing their work. Unfortunately, those protectionist actions really didn't work. The ladies of Venice were not able to get rid of the male prostitutes. So instead, they found a way to raise their competitive status, how competitive they were, through a form of very aggressive advertising that more easily displayed their competitive advantages. They got permission to advertise topless, clearly displaying and offering their wares in a more compelling and more competitive fashion. And so the Street of Breasts was born. Not because of the demands of men, not because of competition between women, but because of competition between women and a cheaper, easier alternative. So the women basically were forced into this position where they had to either devalue what they were offering or start hawking it more aggressively under less favorable competitive conditions. And in the end, they actually had to do both. They had to lower their prices and they had to hawk their wares in a more aggressive manner. And so you can see a similar social phenomenon, something like this, that happens in countries where the viable population of male mates has been reduced for one reason or another, like war or imprisonment, something that has taken a large number of the viable mates out of the population and as available mates. You see that especially places like Russia, where the death rates for males are just catastrophically higher than women, and the life expectancy is so much lower. There's even whole missing generations, and it has had these humongous negative effects on the mating market. But you also see this in its own way on college campuses, where you have gender skews, because these days there's something like 2-to-1 female to male ratios at a lot of colleges. Having way fewer men tends to imbalance the market, and it means if you go there and you're a woman and you're looking to date someone, you're in a way more competitive environment, and you're either going to have to devalue yourself or you're going to have to be way more aggressive about it, and you're not going to get what you want as much. And there's some interesting data on this. The guy who wrote Datanomics, he has a book about that, and he talks about that. And one thing he says, maybe consider going to a school with a higher male population like MIT, because actually they'll treat you like a princess, because you're in the it's sort of a bear market versus bull market. Like, all the guys will treat you like you're the most amazing thing in the world, and you will be treated so wonderfully because there's fewer of you. Anyway, so for any of you trying to decide between MIT or Vassar or something purely based on the dating prospects, might want to give that some thought. And the truth is, college is a major Dating venue, yes, it is where we get educated, but it's also a major sorting mechanism and matching mechanism for dating. But these days, that environment is becoming so skewed. Anyway, so as I said, there's this phenomenon that you see that's similar, where you have populations where the number of male mates has been greatly reduced. Now, in situations like that, female restraint, females saying, hey, we're holding back, we're being really careful about what we give you and what we demand and the conditions that you have to satisfy and who we're willing to accept, what we're willing to accept. Now, that kind of female restraint and guarding of their cartel, that can help maintain their value within the cartel, but it's useless when there are aggressive competitors around, or when there's a real oversupply of women and an undersupply of viable men. Like, women can't hold out for what they really want in those situations. When it's like, sorry, there's 2 women for every guy. There's going to be some major losers here, so you really can't afford to hold out. Or, as I said, if there's some highly aggressive competitor saying, come in, you can't hold out. You know, if more aggressive bidders are coming in. So you end up, like the women of Venice, you end up devaluing what you have to offer, and you end up marketing it more aggressively under less favorable conditions. Now, unfortunately, this balance of supply and demand can be affected by more than just obvious tragedies like war and imprisonment or disease. Other things can alter the sex balance. You know, depression, suicide, addiction, or even just failure to mature can greatly reduce the pool of available and viable, desirable, acceptable, however you want to couch it, mates. And let's not forget that women are really interested in picking from the top. They're most interested in that top 5%. That is a really, really, really well-established fact, that men and women on things like dating sites, and this has been confirmed across so many areas, 80% of women are totally fine with men. Like 8 out of 10, they'd just be like, yeah, I like them. Whereas women, it's like, no, it's the opposite. It's only like the top 20% that they'll even consider, and it's the bottom 80%. Well, what happens if you take that pool and all of a sudden you have cut that pool by a significant amount, and you're still trying to compete with everyone for the top 20%? You are really shrinking. And the truth is, a lot of them are wanting to aim even higher than that. This is one of the problems, is that men are prepared to settle and to be less picky than women are. And they're willing even to accept cheaper and easier alternatives, which is fine for them, I guess. It's not clear that it's great for all of society. It's not really clear that it's actually good for people to get what they want easily and cheaply, when the goods in question are meant to be rarefied, deep, and demanding. But if you've cheapened something like dating, mating, things like that, yeah, then people are going to be willing to just accept very cheap alternatives. They're not going to invest a lot into it because it's no longer a rarefied good. It's not worth pursuing depth in it. It is not worth accepting it being demanding and having to commit a lot to it. Why not just take the cheap alternative? The cost of pornography, from a social and psychological standpoint, using it's virtually nothing. It's free. You don't really have to pay for it. Some people do, but you don't have to. And as I said, we no longer socially ostracize people. You can joke about it on, right on TV for all ages audiences. It's ubiquitous. It's part of life. It's already everywhere. It's already over. The tide is. It's not, ooh, this is a thing coming and there's some debate. No, it's completely over. The battle has already 100% been lost. The territory has virtually all been taken. and the tiny little holdouts that you never even thought it would get into. It's already pretty far into those too. In fact, like I said, pornography is so low cost these days. In fact, the only real upfront cost to pornography is that you're not investing what you put into it into any long-term relationship or even into a short-term relationship. You don't have to invest anything except for a few minutes and some fluids. And virtually all human relationships demand far, far more than that. So what happens in this sort of situation where men don't invest or even engage or maybe even don't encounter the opposite sex, and women are by nature only interested in the top echelon of males? What happens is you completely break the market. So the men at the top basically get everything. This is classically what happens in polyamorous cultures, which also tend to be fairly violent cultures, because it creates so few winners and so many losers among the men in particular. So the men at the top get everything. They have access to what is, in all practicality, an unlimited amount of mates, unlimited access to potential mates, because there just isn't enough of those men to go around, which means they don't really have to commit to any of those mates or seriously invest in any of them. And that's something that you do see in datanomics at places where the gender imbalance is more men than women. You get a lot more serious dating and a lot more marriages, whereas at these colleges where there's way more women than men, you get way fewer marriages and way more just casual relationships and even non-relationships, just casual sex, and it never goes anywhere. It doesn't become anything. So that kind of imbalance is, like I said, if you have things have been shrunk to such a small group, they don't have to really invest anything in any of the options, because the demand is for them is so high. They don't need to settle down, and they can take their time to settle down, and they can set all the conditions, and it's not really good for them either. It messes up your minds to be in that situation. But the funny thing is, meanwhile, the vast swath of men below that 5% elite get virtually nothing, and so they wander off to pursue easier to achieve alternatives, low cost and low commitment relationships. And for more and more men these days, that means porn. And that, again, that's something that you see reflected in statistics. Like, there is way more people in general, young people, but especially men these days, who have had just no sexual partners of any kind, whether in relationship, out of the relationship, whatever. Those numbers have gone crazy high if for like long periods of time. So this huge growing section of men are basically having absolute zero. They're nothing, absolutely no mating success. And then, as I said, you've got this 5% that all the women are competing for, who never have to settle down for anything or can take all the time in the world they want, who get everything. That is the world of polygamy. Like I said, basically, none of the men, not the ones at the bottom or the ones at the top, really have a good reason to commit or to invest in difficult, costly, complicated mating endeavors like long-term relationships with women. And women end up having to operate in this flooded market that devalues their worth and demands intense competition and advertising. At the same time, they're trying to reach for something that has become a rarefied good. That is super messed up, but that is the world of polygamy and gender imbalance. There is a tiny number of winners, and there are tons and tons of losers. But it's actually more complicated than that, because this isn't quite like old school polygamy. So because the women who are out-competing other women are digital women, they're porn actresses, OnlyFans girls, they're basically, in a way, businesses. It's actually an even worse situation than the polygamy of the past, because in the past, polygamy meant that most men lost. Most men didn't get to have a spouse. Most men don't get to have a family. They're basically losers being eliminated. That they just have to attach themselves as a servant to some higher up, higher ranked men. So yeah, in that situation, most men lost. A minority of men got everything, but most women still did get mates, and they got high value mates. Actually, they had to share those mates, but they got what they were technically looking for, which is the top 5%. And almost all the women could have families and could find a mate. It just had to be, you had to share that top 5% person, because you dropped everything below that out of the viable market. But digital polygamy is actually a new frontier. It really differs from both traditional monogamy and from traditional polygamy, because the new digital polygamy comes packaged with a digital gender imbalance, but one going the other way, mimicking the conditions of there being far more available women than men, because digital women can spread themselves around and monopolize many male partners in a way that a real woman couldn't. One digital woman can get 100,000 actual men. In real life she couldn't do that, but the one digital woman can compete on a level that real women never could. And so it creates the appearance online of there being an endless supply and humongous gender imbalance the other way, of there's way more women than men. So you get this weird situation now where both men and most women are being outcompeted for mating opportunities. So now both sexes actually get the worst of both situations. They get the worst of monogamy and they get the worst of polygamy, and both sexes get it. It's a spectacular lose-lose. Everybody loses. So with the fading of monogamy, only a fraction of men will be able to find a mate. That's just, monogamy creates a more egalitarian mating situation. So like I said, monogamy fades, only a fraction of men will be able to find a mate. A ton of men will just fall completely out of the mating market. But with the proliferation of an oversupply of highly competitive, low-cost digital women, only a fraction of women will be able to get a mate. So welcome to the brave new world of modern dating, where everybody is told they're going to get everything that they want, and nobody actually is. So that's all for today. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.